The Titanic was celebrated as the most advanced, largest, and most impressive steam-powered ocean liner ever constructed in its time. Created by the British company White Star Line as part of a trio of massive vessels, the Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, it stood as a symbol of engineering ambition and luxurious transatlantic travel. Although these liners were not the fastest ships afloat, none could rival them in scale, interior design, and comfort. The Titanic alone could carry roughly 3,500 people. No expense was spared during its construction, as the ship featured heated pools, a Turkish bath, a spacious gymnasium, elegant restaurants, a library, smoking rooms, promenades, grand vestibules, and wide staircases decorated with oak and walnut. Its most iconic feature was the first-class grand staircase beneath a large glass dome. The ship's fame was largely tied to its engineered unsinkability, since the lower hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments separated by bulkheads. According to its design, the ship could remain afloat even if 4 forward or aft compartments flooded or if any 2 random ones were breached. With such a reputation, the Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats, enough for less than half of the people on board, yet still fully compliant with maritime regulations of the period. On April 10, 1912, the Titanic set off on its maiden voyage toward North America. Even its departure was dramatic, as when it left Southampton, the suction created by the enormous hull pulled a nearby ship, the New York, off its moorings, nearly causing a collision that was avoided by only a few centimeters. The Titanic then made stops in France and Ireland before heading into the Atlantic with around 2,200 people on board, more than half of them passengers. Life on board was divided strictly by class. First class hosted society elites and wealthy travelers. Second class accommodated middle-class families and professionals, while third class mostly consisted of immigrants, laborers, and people seeking a new life abroad. To prevent the spread of disease, third-class areas were physically separated from the upper classes by bulkheads. The ship was commanded by 62-year-old Captain Edward Smith, regarded as one of the most experienced captains of the era. Also on board were White Star Line director Bruce Ismay, the man who pushed for the ship's creation, and chief designer Thomas Andrews. On the night of April 14, 1912, despite repeated warnings about drifting icebergs in the area, the Titanic maintained a speed of 21 knots. Sailing quickly through icy waters was common practice among steamships of the era. But conditions that night made iceberg detection nearly impossible, since the sea was unnaturally calm without wind or waves, and the sky was moonless. With no moonlight and no white surf breaking around the bases of icebergs, the ocean appeared as a perfectly dark, flat surface. Temperatures also dropped sharply from 6 degrees Celsius in the afternoon to freezing by evening. Visibility was further compromised because the ship's lookouts had no binoculars, as an officer had locked them away and the key had been mistakenly taken ashore. Titanic's radio operators received at least 6 messages about large ice formations, but only 4 were passed to the bridge. The last warning arrived just 40 minutes before the collision, but it was cut short by the radio man, who was overwhelmed with transmitting private passenger telegrams. Shortly before midnight, one of the lookouts finally spotted a large iceberg directly ahead, roughly 500 meters in front of the bow. First Officer William Murdoch reacted immediately by ordering the engines reversed and steering the ship hard to port in an attempt to swing the bow away. But the gigantic vessel turned too slowly. At 2340, the ship brushed along the iceberg's starboard side, and in a matter of seconds, the ice tore open several sections of steel plating below the waterline. At least 5 forward compartments began to flood rapidly. The design allowed the ship to survive flooding in 4 compartments, not 5, and that single additional flooded space sealed the ship's fate. Although the total rupture area measured about 1 square meter, the damage stretched roughly 90 to 100 meters along the hull. Experts still debate the exact mechanism of the failure. Some argue that low-quality rivets snapped under pressure, while others believe the steel plates, made brittle by low temperatures, cracked instead of bending. The most widely accepted explanation is that the hull was crushed inward, forcing seams apart rather than producing a clean whole. Thomas Andrews quickly assessed the situation and informed Captain Smith that the ship would sink once water spilled over the tops of the bulkheads. The unsinkable liner was now doomed. Captain Smith ordered distress signals to be transmitted and lifeboat loading to begin, following the rule of women and children first. At first, many passengers refused to enter the boats because the ship still appeared stable and fully lit, resulting in several lifeboats leaving partially empty. As the bow continued to drop and panic spread, the true scale of the disaster became undeniable. Throughout the chaos, the ship's musicians continued to play on the boat deck until the very last moments. Neither Captain Smith nor Thomas Andrews attempted to save themselves. As the bow submerged completely, the stern rose high above the water, and eventually the stresses caused the hull to break in two.
The bow plunged first, followed roughly 2 minutes later by the stern. The Titanic remained afloat for 2 hours and 40 minutes after striking the iceberg. Only about 700 people were able to board the lifeboats. The crew did not manage to launch the final 2 boats because they were washed overboard by the rising water. Approximately 1,500 people were left struggling in the freezing ocean. Their cries echoed across the still night, but faded within half an hour. Only 2 lifeboats returned to rescue survivors, saving fewer than 10 people. Later analysis showed that the launched lifeboats had enough unused space to hold at least 400 more individuals. About 90 minutes after the Titanic disappeared beneath the surface, the rescue ship Carpathia reached the site and retrieved the survivors. For weeks afterward, ships traveling across the North Atlantic encountered bodies floating among the debris, a region sailors grimly referred to as a floating cemetery. Just over 300 bodies were recovered, mostly belonging to first-class passengers, while more than 1,000 victims were never found. Investigations revealed that the tragedy resulted from a devastating combination of human errors, inadequate safety standards, miscommunications, and environmental conditions. Third-class passengers suffered greatly because many were not informed in time and had difficulty navigating the complex corridors leading to the boat deck, and some internal gates were reportedly closed, delaying their escape. At the time, No laws regulated speed in ice-infested waters, and carrying too few lifeboats was not considered negligence if the ship met outdated legal standards. A major point of controversy involved the nearby ship Californian, which was drifting only 20 to 30 kilometers away, and its crew saw 8 white rockets fired from the Titanic. Captain Stanley Lord was informed, but he merely ordered attempts to signal the distant ship with a searchlight, and when no reply was seen, he took no further action. Some unverified accounts mention another ship, the Samson, illegally hunting seals nearby, and its crew allegedly fled the scene after seeing rockets, thinking they were being pursued by authorities. Bruce Ismay, who escaped in a lifeboat while many women and children were still aboard the ship, became the most heavily criticized figure. Although official inquiries cleared him of wrongdoing, his public image was destroyed, and he spent the rest of his life in isolation. The first official inquiry, in 1912, concluded that the disaster was caused by a chain of unfortunate circumstances, but a later ruling determined that the primary cause was the ship's excessive speed in an area known to contain ice. White Star Line was ultimately found responsible and required to compensate the victims' families. The tragedy led to sweeping safety reforms, and ships were henceforth required to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. White flares were formally designated as distress signals, and the International Ice Patrol was established to monitor icebergs in the North Atlantic, an institution that still operates today. The wreck of the Titanic was finally discovered in 1985 at a depth of 3,750 meters, and the bow and stern lie around 650 meters apart, surrounded by thousands of scattered artifacts. The entire structure is covered in layers of rust and strange formations created by bacteria that slowly consume the metal. Although no human remains have been found, investigators have discovered numerous pairs of shoes silently marking where victims once lay.
Studies show that after the ship broke apart, the bow section plunged at around 55 kilometers per hour, embedding itself deep in the seabed, while the stern descended even faster, nearly 80 kilometers per hour, rotating as it fell, collapsing floors, tearing open decks, and folding the structure into distorted layers. Researchers predict that what remains of the decks will eventually collapse under their own weight. The sinking of the Titanic remains one of history's most well-known maritime disasters, deeply influencing global culture and serving as a lasting reminder of human limitation in the face of nature's immense power.